Okay, David, I'll hand it over to you.
All right. Well, I would like to welcome all of our guests to a special presentation of the French and Indian War Foundation of an online educational exhibit preview of Surveyor to Patriot, the story of George Washington and Fort Loudoun. The foundation commissioned this project as part of the commemoration of the 250th anniversary of the origin of our country, and it's made possible in part by a grant given to us by the VA 250 Commission. My name is David Grasso. I'm president of the foundation. I'm presently at the headquarters of our organization on North Loudoun Street in Winchester. With me here this evening is the secretary of our organization, Donna Light. And with that, I will turn the presentation over to the actual project director, Jessica Pritchard Ritter. I'm sorry, Pritchard Ritter. She's a member of our board, and she spent the last several months putting this together. So, Jess?
Wonderful. I'm going to share my screen, make sure that you all can hear my sound. Okay, great. Like David said, my name is Jess Pritchard Ritter. I'm a digital public historian, and I own For the Love of History Consulting, where I work with small organizations like the French and Indian War Foundation to take these local stories and share them online. I create online exhibits and do a lot of educational outreach. That's really my passion, is the teaching part of stories. History is complicated. Anyone who loves it, studies it, understands there's a lot of complexities to it. So when it came to the American Revolution and we were kind of tackling this project, we thought, we have this iconic figure of George Washington, this big story in our little town. It's a special story to us. Locals know a lot about Washington and Winchester, but we couldn't figure out, how can we take our little story with a big figure and during the French and Indian War and connect it to the Revolution. We know that it's a part of the Revolution, but to really understand history, you can't just drop into a time period and start studying it. It's so much bigger than that. So when it comes to studying the American Revolution, it's so much more than just a series of battles or notable patriots. You have to really look at the bigger picture. And that's really where this story comes in. Washington, of course, is arguably one of the most thoroughly researched individuals in American history, but his story in Winchester isn't as widely known. And so we really wanted to take the opportunity to take our small story from our little town and put it into the bigger picture of the American Revolution. And so that's what this project does. And it's a really big story. The exhibit has a lot to it. So I do hope that if you haven't had a chance to look at the online exhibit, that you do. I'm not going to be able to talk about everything tonight, but we've pulled out some highlights, and hopefully you'll get sort of the Reader's Digest of what this story is all about. But Fort Loudoun, Winchester, Washington, it really does give us a vehicle to travel a lot of the colonial history timeline and truly cover a lot of history. So let's get to it. We're going to start with the Shenandoah Valley. Before European settlements came to Virginia's Shenandoah Valley, the region was carved with active pathways traveled by American Indians for trade and communication with other nations. A large trail, one of the larger trails, ran north and south. You can see it here. It's what we now call Route 11. It's modern day Route 11. So here it is running right through the valley. And here we are up in Winchester. If you're not from Virginia, I just wanted to sort of orient you where we're talking. So we call it Route 11, but it's been called the Great Warrior Path. It's been called the Indian Trail. Once settlements continued to grow out here in the valley, it also was often called the Great Wagon Road. In the 1730s, Sir William Gooch, Virginia's lieutenant governor, pushed to extend settlements west of the Blue Ridge Mountains. We started to see a lot of westward expansion, colonial version of westward expansion. The Blue Ridge Mountains were the boundary line designated by the Treaty of Albany in 1722. So he began issuing land grants that would total over 1 million acres during his administration, which went up to 1749. So the Shenandoah Valley was actually settled by these land grant recipients who would then recruit families like the Heights and the Bowmans and the Stevens. These are big family names still here in Frederick County in the northern Shenandoah Valley. And they would ultimately settle in the northern Shenandoah Valley. And I'm telling you this because how does Washington fit into all of this? Well, he was a surveyor, right? I don't, maybe you know, maybe you don't know, but Washington as a young man was a surveyor, and that was ultimately what brought him out to the Shenandoah Valley. So it is an important part of understanding, we're setting the stage so we don't just throw you into 1756. These are some of the key moments in Washington's early life that place him here in Winchester. So one of his earliest journals is from the spring of 1748 when he was just 16 years old. And he had the opportunity to travel with a friend and neighbor, George William Fairfax, and his surveying party that went all throughout Virginia's western frontier. Washington was really close to the Fairfax family of Belvoir, especially after his half-brother Lawrence married Anne Fairfax, who was the daughter of Colonel William Fairfax and the sister of George William Fairfax, Washington's friend. This particular journey is really important in Washington's story and his ultimate role in Winchester because it's the first time he really traveled to the Shenandoah Valley. He came to Virginia's western frontier and he really became familiar with Frederick County and beyond. In his journal entries, you really begin to see Washington's network of prominent Virginians developing. He's really starting to grow that network and get that experience. In the exhibit, we've pulled out several parts of his journal, and you can actually read the journal online if you want to, but it is really cool to sort of, in his own words, as a teenager traveling, he talks about where they stayed, who they saw, what they did, and it's a really immersive experience into 1748 and this really important journey for him. So the trip with the Fairfaxes, the surveying party, not only gained him invaluable experience in the art of surveying, but it also introduced him to Virginia's western frontier. And that's really key in understanding then ultimately what led to him building Fort Loudoun in Winchester. And again, on the website, we have a deeper dive on surveying, and there's a great video from Colonial Williamsburg that kind of talks you through what did surveying in the colonial era look like, and it's a really great visual. So if you're interested, that's there. So we're gonna fast forward a few years. I'm not kidding when I say it's a lot of history. So we are moving quickly. So we are now in 1753. A few years later, the French are moving south. They're coming from Canada and they're starting to build forts in the Ohio River Valley. They've just built Fort Le Boeuf in the Ohio River Valley. And simply put, the British were really unimpressed because you can see this pink swath. This, according to Britain, was all Virginia territory. This was the colony of Virginia. And so when they built Fort Le Boeuf in the northern Ohio River Valley, the British were like, off you get. You got to go back north. You're in our territory. What are you doing? And the French were like, no, actually, it's our territory too. And that was sort of when you start to see tension start to brew. So we have 21-year-old George Washington, and Virginia's colonial governor, Robert Dinwiddie, tasks Washington with this really important message to send to the French commander, saying basically in so many words, please evacuate. I'm going to read part of Governor Dinwiddie's letter, and it's very plainly stated, and you can read it online too if you want to read it in full. But he says, the lands upon the River Ohio in the western parts of the colony of Virginia are so notoriously known to be the property of the Crown of Great Britain that it is a matter of equal concern and surprise to me to hear that a body of French forces are erecting fortresses and making settlements upon that river within His Majesty's dominions. However, sir, in obedience to my instructions, it becomes my duty to require your peaceable departure, and that you would forbear prosecuting a purpose to interruptive of the harmony and good understanding which His Majesty is desirous to continue and cultivate with the most Christian king. This precursor to the French and Indian War is well documented. but it's an important part in understanding Washington's journey from Surveyor to Patriot. Again, he's 21 years old. He's a major in the Virginia militia when he receives these really important orders to take this really quite dangerous journey up through the Ohio River Valley. This painting here is of him and Christopher Gist crossing the Allegheny. It was a really treacherous trip, nearly killed him. There's a lot online about it. We have a lot of rabbit holes. If you want to do a deeper dive, it's on there, but it is an important thing to understand to ultimately get us to Winchester in 1756. Now, I don't ordinarily do this, but because we're covering so much history, we're doing a crash course in French and Indian War history. I have a video from the History Channel, and it's only 2.5 minutes, but it does, I think, a really good job giving more of the emotional experiences of Washington from when he traveled to the Ohio River Valley to you have Jumonville Glen, and then you have Fort Necessity. And the video does a really good job kind of capturing that very succinctly and doing the visualization. And then that'll kind of get us spun up so that we're a little bit closer to 1756. Holler if you can't hear it when I hit play.
It's 1753, and a brash 21-year-old George Washington gets his first military assignment in the wilderness of Indian country.
I recall when I was a young officer in the Virginia Regiment, I was commissioned and appointed by the governor of Virginia to visit and deliver a letter to the commandant of the French forces on the Ohio, and set out on the intended journey the same day.
He's full of himself. He's just been made a lieutenant colonel. He's leading Virginia troops. He's the commander. He's going out with an expedition to fight the French forces out that way. He's probably pretty proud of himself, and he doesn't know what he doesn't know. He's not had military schooling, and he may have thought he was a lot more competent than he really was.
We have, with nature's assistance, made a good entrenchment, and by clearing the bushes out of these meadows, prepared a charming field for an encounter.
But the encounter is far from charming. Washington has the fort built on low ground where it can be easily attacked.
Fire!
About 9 o'clock on the 3rd of July, the enemy advanced with shouts and dismal Indian yells to our entrenchments. They then, from every little rising tree, stump, stone, and bush, kept up a constant galling fire upon us.
In just a few short hours, Washington is soundly defeated. Out of 305 men, 31 were killed and 70 wounded.
He deals with the French commander. They let him march back with his weapons if he promises to go back to Virginia. He has no choice, so he goes back a defeated officer in his first campaign.
With every failure he learned, and learned from that failure to do better the next time. And with that determination, he was persistent. He never gave up. He never quit, even in the midst of failure.
So I included that because, again, we're doing a crash course to get up to 1756. So he's in the Shenandoah Valley, he's surveying, has this really important, again, consolidating. He goes up to the Ohio River Valley. The French aren't going to leave. And he's got Jumonville Glen, which there's a lot more on the exhibit about that. And he's got Fort Necessity, which was a defeat. It was not a good day for him, to say the least. So all of these are really character building moments that I think all of us can relate. Well, we can't relate to having military defeats, but just those character building moments of being young. And he had an immense responsibility. And it's really important to remember that as we now get to Fort Loudoun, because a lot of those lessons from those early character building moments do come into play in his letters, his orders that happen at Fort Loudoun. So it's why we pulled out those key moments, because they are important in understanding Washington's Washington at Fort Loudoun. So here we are. We have mounting tensions, attacks, and Virginia's frontier. We did a crash course to get up here. Fort Loudoun is really the product of Washington's early experiences as a young man. And because of the knowledge he gained surveying the western frontier, Washington knew that Virginia needed another fort to provide the much needed defense for the men, women, and children living in the Shenandoah Valley. So tensions are continuing to mount between the British and the French. Fear was spreading amongst the colonists. You've got, particularly in the largely unprotected and vulnerable western frontier. And I'm going to read an excerpt from a letter that Washington wrote to Governor Dinwiddie on April 24th, 1756, because I think it expresses the urgency of trying to protect the frontier. He says, "Not an hour, nay, scarcely a minute passes that does not produce fresh alarms and melancholy accounts, so that I am distracted what to do. Nor is it possible for me to give the people the necessary assistance for their defense, upon account of the small number of men we have, or is likely to be here for some time. The inhabitants are removing daily. 3 families were murdered the night before last at the distance of less than 12 miles from this place, being Winchester. And every day we have accounts of such cruelties and barbarities as are shocking to human nature, nor is it possible to conceive the situation and danger of this miserable county, being Frederick County. Such numbers of French and Indians all around, no road is safe to travel, and here we know not the hour how soon we may be attacked." It's true that by 1756, when this letter was written, families were being attacked up and down by American Indian war parties up and down the Shenandoah Valley. Washington was headquartered in Winchester, but most of the Virginia Regiment was stationed at Fort Cumberland, which left roughly 60 miles of territory unprotected and vulnerable to more attacks. So he was advocating for a fort to be built, and he really didn't want he wanted a chain of forts to be built. And he didn't want more than 15 to 18 miles to be between the forts, because that's about 1 day's march. That was the goal. So we have the need, but why Winchester? The Shenandoah Valley was sparsely populated in the 1700s, especially in Fredericktown, which is what Winchester was called back then. But it's important to understand that this part of the Shenandoah Valley was truly the frontier. It didn't have protection of other cities. So the settlers really were vulnerable from French and American Indian war parties. Washington knew this. He knew the region's vulnerability, and he kept advocating repeatedly for a large fort to be built in Winchester. He wanted it to be a sanctuary for its townspeople because he knew they needed it. Winchester was a small town. It only had 60 cabins, but it really was strategically speaking, it was a really important crossroad. You had the Great Wagon Road, you had Route 11 running north to Philadelphia. If you went south, you went straight through the Shenandoah Valley. If you went west, you went to Fort Duquesne, Braddock's Road, which took you out to Fort Duquesne. And if you went east, you went to Williamsburg and Alexandria. So it really was a very important hub, and Washington again knew that, given his experience out on the frontier. It was a convenient location for gathering intelligence from the frontier, providing supply routes between major cities, and it also was a good spot for colonial government to pass through. They had a place to stay if they were going from Williamsburg elsewhere. So, in other words, Washington continued to advocate for this fort and repeatedly warned the House of Burgesses, "You have to approve Fort Loudoun. Like, time is of the essence. It's kind of now or never." So after a lot of candid correspondences, the House of Burgesses finally approved Washington's request to build Fort Loudoun in Winchester, and Governor Dinwiddie wrote to Washington on May 3rd, 1756, and he said, "I'm sincerely concerned for your situation from the many flying parties of French and Indians, but I hope before this reaches you, a large body of militia are at Winchester to reinforce you, and if possible, to drive the enemy over the Allegheny Mountains. I approve for the reasons you assign the fortifying of Winchester, and when the militia arrives, you may employ many of them on that business." So he got the green light to build the fort. So what I'm trying some new things out tonight, so I hope you guys are okay with it. You can see this is a 3-dimensional drawing of Fort Loudoun, of what we think it looked like using primary and secondary sources. And then Norman Baker was a renowned historian, and he did a lot of work for the French and Indian War Foundation. And this drawing here is an overlay of the fort in over a modern map of Winchester. So you can just see the sheer size of it. It really did have a presence sitting up on a hill. And if you're not from Winchester, you really do. It does sit up on a hill. It would have had a presence back then. So it's a cool, and if you go to the website, you can actually zoom in and kind of see it a little more clearly. But we were very fortunate to have a three-dimensional video tour, a three-dimensional recreation of Fort Loudoun. And so what I'm going to do, and I think this works, I'm going to be your virtual tour guide. So there's no sound. So I'm going to play it and pretend that we're going to have this immersive experience and go into the fort. And while you're touring the fort, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the architecture. And this part of the presentation I pulled from Norman Baker. It was an essay he wrote on the architecture of Fort Loudoun. At moments, it can feel like a roller coaster, so I hope you have fun. So Washington got to work. He got the House of Burgesses approved the chain of forts in the valley. He got the green light to build Fort Loudoun, so he immediately started to design and plan. He created a couple of designs, ultimately settling on what you see now. This was a really popular design of the period of the colonial era. And he wanted it to be successful. He ended up buying a lot in downtown Winchester, and you can still see the lot. We have Google Maps in the exhibit, so you can kind of drop a pin and sort of tour the street corner if you're not from town. Washington actually brought his own blacksmith from Mount Vernon to work at the blacksmith shop that he built on the property that he bought in downtown Winchester, so that his blacksmith would supply ironwork during the fort's construction. And we can really see the discipline that Washington had as a young man showcased in everything he does to try to make Fort Loudoun a success. But he had a lot of challenges, in large part because he was responsible for training the men to be soldiers as well as contractors. So here we are entering the fort. It adhered closely to the classic geometric formula used by military engineers of the period. It was positioned on the crest of the hill immediately north of town, which you can still see today. Because it was at the top of a hill, they had to bring in a lot of dirt to fill it in, so that they would have a nice level base to actually build the fort and have the horizontal timber construction. The outline of the fort completed a square with a bastion at each corner. Each bastion was designed with embrasures in the parapets for mounting 6 cannons, so there were a total of 24 weapons in the fort. The bastion faces the widest and extended wall of the bastions were 55 feet, and the flanks connecting the faces of the fort proper were 18 feet. The bastions were covered to provide flooring for the cannon and for storage below. The south bastion was actually used as the fort's magazine, which you'll see in the tour as well. It's coming up, so you can see the cannons, and then underneath was the magazine storage. The fort's magazine. The curtains of the fort, the walls or ramparts connecting the flanks of the bastions were 78 feet, and the base of the ramparts were 18 feet wide, constructed of outer and inner walls of interlocked horizontal hewn timbers with the space between the walls filled with earth and stone. So 18 feet wide is how thick the walls are. The ramparts of the curtains and the bastions were raised to a height of 16 feet. And then the outer rampart walls tapered inward at a slight degree. And then the inner walls were straight up and down, straight vertical. There were 5 buildings inside the fort, and they were placed against the inner rampart walls of the fort. 3 of them against the north, east, and west walls were 2-story buildings, basically designed as barracks. And then you had 2 1.5-story structures placed against each side, which you can see right here of the main entryway. One of them was Washington's quarters, and then the other one was a jail. And then you also have the well. The well is a really fascinating part. It's the only physical structure that still exists today. And we do have a lot of really great research online. So if you do go to the exhibit, I hope you'll read more about the well digger and see some of the primary sources we have and some of the efforts that the foundation is trying to do to preserve the well and do right by the one physical structure that's left of the fort. And then there was supposed to be a ditch or a moat. It was included in Washington's plan for the perimeter. We're getting ready to go down the well. It's pretty cool. It's one of my favorite parts of the video. So there was supposed to be a ditch or a moat that was included in Washington's plan for the perimeter of the fort, but the shallow soil covering the limestone hill kind of put a kibosh on that. So possible exceptions, at least for partial ditching, would have been limited to the areas where there was substantial dirt added to provide a level base for the projecting bastions. I think it's a really great interpretation. We're lucky to have this video where you're able to kind of go in and see what it may have looked like, what we think it looked like. Do you guys have any questions so far? I'm doing a lot of talking. Guess we can wait. So he got the approval, he built the fort, we just toured it. There were a lot of struggles that Washington faced building Fort Loudoun, and I think it's an important part of the story, and it really is also, it still adds to what gave him that character building. It was not easy for him. Dr. Carl Eckberg is a well-reputed historian, and he's done a phenomenal amount of work with the French and Indian War Foundation. He's actively involved, and he called Winchester Washington's Classroom and Humphrey Bland's Treatise of Military Discipline Washington's master textbook. Now, again, while he was building Fort Loudoun, Washington was only 24 years old when he received approval from the House of Burgesses to begin building Fort Loudoun. He was managing the Virginia militia, and he was also serving as the British's eyes and ears out on the western frontier. So after his defeat at Fort Necessity, Washington began to really practice extreme discipline, and he had high expectations for the men around him, for the militia around him. Dr. Eckberg said that Washington kept a treatise of military discipline by his bedside, and he recommended it to all of his junior officers. Immersing himself in it, Washington both learned about military affairs and improved his prose style, which became clearer and more grammatical over time. He was burning with high ambitions, but understanding his limitations from lack of formal schooling, Washington was a relentless self-improver. The exhibit has a lot of militia orders, quotes from Washington, letters back and forth, both to Washington and written from Washington. Part of his frustration, there were a lot of tippling houses. We're going to talk about the human experience of trying to make something out of Fort Loudoun, which was really what Washington was trying to do. There were tippling houses, there were taverns, and the men would get drunk, and it would annoy him. It would annoy Washington because he's trying to make Fort Loudoun this reputable force to be reckoned with, and the men can't keep it together, right? And it was actually, I'm chuckling. It's not really funny, but it is interesting to read in the letters. There was a fairly popular tippling house in Winchester, and Washington went as far as to ask the owner of the tippling house, Stephen Rawlins, to stop serving alcohol to the soldiers, and Rawlins didn't do that. And so Washington had 2 guards essentially placed on either side of the door to try to discourage bad behavior. And so then Rawlins just got the guards drunk, and it was just chaos, and it drove Washington crazy. So he was dealing with kind of chaos from the soldiers. And then desertion was a big struggle that Washington dealt with, and the quotes are changing. I pulled different quotes from his letters. Desertion was another big struggle for Washington, who was so disciplined, but not everyone shared his discipline, not everyone shared his dedication. So you can really get a sense of his frustration and desperation to get his men to straighten up and be good soldiers, quite literally good soldiers. So he did have some tactics that he tried to use and leverage over the men to try to discourage desertion, one of which was very public executions. So in an order he issued on May 18th, 1756, he was very strategic in warning new recruits of the consequences for desertion by executing a sergeant who'd been sentenced to death for his desertion. And in this order, it says all the troops are then to appear on the parade Captain Woodward is to read the articles of war to them and acquaint them that his honor, Governor Dinwiddie, has been pleased to approve of the sentence of the general court-martial which condemned Sergeant Lewis and has sent up his death warrant, and that he will, in consequence thereof, be shot as soon as the new recruits arrive from Fredericksburg. It's hoped all of his way of thinking will take warning from his death. The caution is unnecessary to the brave who are stimulated by those noble principles of honor and courage. So he would often use this visual graphic tactic to warn new recruits of his zero tolerance policy for desertion. And then you had mercy via enlistment in the Virginia Regiment. And some of you may know this, but I'm going to just talk about a little nuance. So Fort Loudoun garrisoned men from the Virginia Militia as well as the Virginia Regiment. And it is important to understand the difference between the two. So the Virginia Militia was made up of free, able-bodied men who could fight, but who weren't formally trained soldiers. And then you had the Virginia Regiment, on the other hand, which comprised soldiers that were trained by and for the British Crown. The Virginia militia was a little harder to control and keep in order, so Washington started a policy of immediately drafting any militiamen who deserted into the Virginia Regiment. And the orders are online if you want to read them. So now we've covered a lot, kind of talking at rapid pace. So we have the making of a leader, talked about the struggles and trying to build this reputable fort that formidable fort. As a commander of the Virginia Regiment from 1756 to 1758, Washington had mixed success, but the experience he gained during this period really were proven, they were invaluable later in his career. And he submitted his resignation in the end of 1758, and I'm going to read his officers of the Virginia Regiment wrote a pretty emotional letter to him when they learned of his resignation, and we've pulled most of it is on the exhibit, but I do want to read part of it. I think it's important to understand. We've talked about he's young, he's in the valley, he sees the need, he kind of had those character building moments. He's building the fort. He's got a lot of struggle. He's trying to rein in the chaos. And I think that the letter from his officers really kind of, they really do show that he did make a difference. And although he had a lot of struggle, he made a difference. So I'm going to read part of it. They say, the happiness we have enjoyed and the honor we have acquired together with the mutual regard that has always subsisted between you and your officers have implanted so sensible an affection in the minds of us all that we cannot be silent at this critical occasion. In our earliest infancy, you took us under your tuition, trained us upon the practice of that discipline which alone can constitute good troops, from the punctual observance of which you can never suffered the least deviation. Your steady adherence to impartial justice, your quick discernment and invariable regard to merit of true honor and passion for glory, from which the great military achievements have been derived, first heightened our natural emulation and our desire to excel. How much we have improved by those regulations and by your own example, with what alacrity we have hitherto discharged our duty, with what cheerfulness we have encountered the severest toils, especially while under your particular directions, we submit to yourself and flatter ourselves that we have in a great measure answered your expectations. How rare it is to find those amiable qualifications blended together in one man, who, in short, so able to support the military character of Virginia. And I think it's really heartwarming, and it's, like I said, it shows the relationship that he had with his men, and that it did struggles aside, he was successful. I think arguably at Fort Loudoun, he was successful. And we do have his response. You can see some of it here. I pulled a quote from it. He was really moved by the letter from his men after hearing about his resignation. Okay, so now we're at the Revolution. We've covered a lot. We're almost there, almost to the learning activities. So this here is actually a map that was drawn in 1777 by Captain Andreas Wiederhold, a Hessian soldier and prisoner captured during the Battle of Trenton. And he drew a map of Winchester, which is gold to a historian to have a document like this, a primary source like this. So you can see Fort Loudoun on the hill here. And we have a really cool kind of before and after on the exhibit. So you can kind of slide back and forth and see an overlay of a modern map with this 1777 map. So Fort Loudoun went on to be a rendezvous site, around a point of rendezvous, and it also went on to be a POW camp. So Colonel James Wood is a real prominent figure here in Winchester. And during the Revolutionary War, he actually had a lot of roles, including overseeing and leading the Convention Army in Virginia. So when the British and Allied troops were captured during the Battle of Saratoga, a convention treaty was signed to govern them. They were kept in Charlottesville, Virginia. Colonel Wood ended up moving the troops of Hessian and British prisoners from Charlottesville north toward Winchester because the British was nearing Charlottesville. So some of the soldiers were kept, some of the prisoners were kept at Fort Loudoun, and some of them continued to move north. So Thomas Anbury was a British officer who was captured at the Battle of Saratoga, and he wrote and published a book in the late 1700s, and it was criticized a bit for its inaccuracies and embellishments, but he does have this account of being a prisoner at Fort Loudoun, so do with it what you will. But he says, Winchester is an irregular built town containing between 300 and 400 houses. It was last war, as it is at present, the rendezvous of Virginia troops in excursions against the Indians. By an inhabitant who resided in the town during the last war, I was informed that before we reached Fort Duquesne, the country round about it was greatly ravaged by the Indians who committed horrid barbarities, and the town itself was in great danger, and would certainly have been leveled to the ground, and its inhabitants massacred, had not Colonel Washington, the present famous general, erected a fort upon an eminence at the north end of town that fully protected it, notwithstanding the Indians were so bold as to venture in sight of the town, but never within reach of the fort. So it's a pretty powerful testament. So even all the years later during the Revolution, I shouldn't say all the year, it really wasn't that much time between the French and Indian War and the American Revolution, but the fort was still standing and it was still used. And so it's sort of a very cause and effect moment. It's a really great teachable moment for students to understand Washington building Fort Loudoun did still have a role in the American Revolution. Fast and Furious. We do have, because my passion is education, we do have learning activities. I may actually stop for a minute, and I see some questions. So I'm going to stop for a minute and then I'll circle back to the learning activities and talk about that for a minute. And I see a lot of things in this chat. Do you guys have any questions so far? And then if not, I'll talk about the learning activities and then kind of wrap up. We covered a lot of history, so if nobody has questions, that's totally fine too.
You're doing a good job.
I appreciate it, Jim. Thank you.
Here, here, we agree.
I appreciate it. It's a lot of history, so I'm talking quickly.
I mean, once you start, it won't stop. So
I
I
know.
won't open that floodgate.
I know, right? Okay, I'm going to talk about the learning activities because it was a big part of this project, and I think it's part of what makes our project kind of special. Is not only do we have this really great story, but we really tried to create these original learning activities so that we could share it with Virginia educators. So let me go back to my screen. So we created three original learning activities, and we worked with educators across the state of Virginia to make sure that we were not just telling a cool story, but we really wanted to create an out-of-the-box, ready-to-use lesson plan that they could pick up and go with. So I talked with several educators across the state. I'm really grateful for them I know they're overextended, so I was really grateful that they gave me the time to let me pick their brain, and they were really insightful. So our lesson plans align with the Virginia SOLs. That's not to say that people outside of this, educators and families outside of the state of Virginia, can't use them, but we did cater them to Virginia educators. So they do align with the Virginia SOLs. And it covers, I have in each lesson plan, we have an elementary, middle, and high school. And we also have a learning activity packet for young students, young historians in lower elementary school. But this first lesson plan is for 4th and 5th graders, and each activity has its own lesson plan with the course, the Virginia SOL, the grades, and then about how long it'll take, an introduction. And I've set the activities up so that it's very narrative, because part of what I love about history is it's just a story. And who doesn't love a good story? And so when you're trying to inspire kids, we really tried to focus on that narrative element to try to get kids really engaged and involved. So it's very narrative. We have the Virginia standards, the skills, the objectives, and then the actual kind of roadmap through the activity. And we try to create some autonomy so that if an educator doesn't have 45 minutes, maybe they can pull bits and pieces, or if they actually have extra time, we have some supplemental resources. There's so much great stuff out there from the National Park Service, Mount Vernon, Colonial Williamsburg. So we've tried to layer in, it's one of the beautiful things about digital humanities, we can layer in a lot of other resources. So you can stay on the surface, or if you're interested, you can drill down deeper. So each one has the lesson plan, and then it has a learning guide. And this sort of gives, especially for the standards of learning, the SOLs, it's almost like a cheat sheet it's like it's a nice overview of what students really need to take away. And again, these learning guides do align with some of the key points that are in the SOL. So when I was writing it, I sort of figured it's like a study guide. I call it a learning guide, but it's essentially a study guide. And this parallels the activity. And in each activity, there is a Google form. So it's a very immersive, there's videos layered in and primary sources. And so students are really able to engage with these primary sources. And this is all free for teachers to use in the project. So we have.
Hey, Jess, you were asking for questions. Scott put a question in the comment field for you.
Okay. Let me get through the lessons and then I will take a look. So the learning activities we have, so like I said, we have 3 for fourth and fifth graders, 5th and 6th graders, and then high school, 9th through 12th. And then this is the learning guide for younger historians. And it's sort of a nice overview of Fort Loudoun so that you kind of have some talking points from Fort Loudoun. And then fun facts on the fort, the actual architecture. This was done by Jim Moyer. I pulled it from his site. It's a great resource. Some of the architecture terminology, and then fun facts, because we're talking about young kids or young historians, and just want to inspire them and sort of throw things at them. And it's amazing what they process. Never underestimate their brains. They're incredible. So, and then a coloring sheet, because I find that tends to land well if kids can color, younger kids can color. Okay, Fast and Furious. Thank you. I know it was a big story. I thank you all for your patience. Again, like David said, this project was funded by a very generous grant from the Virginia 250 in partnership with Virginia Humanities. I'm Jess. I run for the Love of History Consulting, and I just love to tell stories and teach. It's my passion.